So my name's Marc Imbrescia. I'm a software engineer at Etsy. And my talk is called Internalizing Location Services with GeoNames. And as you'll see, it could also be called Internationalizing Location Services with GeoNames because we did both at the same time. So how many people here know what Etsy is? Almost all of you. How about GeoNames? Some of you. So GeoNames is an open source location database. It's freely available. You can download it. It has over 8 million place names, hierarchical data, translations into other languages, all sorts of other good stuff that you can use to power your own location services. So we were in a position where we needed to stop using our location provider API so much because we kept getting rate limited. And we needed to start being able to display location names in multiple languages. So we took that opportunity to bring all of our services in-house. And we use Solr to power our location search, as well as our local search for our listings. We have many listings on Etsy, and local search is a somewhat important tool for some of our members. Not for everybody, but for some of our members. Etsy, we like to call ourselves the world's handmade marketplace. We have almost 20 million unique items, 18 million daily searches of those items, 800,000 sellers, all selling unique things. Some people sell the same thing over and over again. Some people make everything one of a kind. So we have an interesting search problem with that some of my colleagues are here to talk about as well. And we get 28 million unique visitors a month. We're a relatively large site. We have a developer blog, codeiscraft.etsy.com, where we talk about the different challenges that we have. So if you're interested, feel free to check it out. And we have almost 450 worldwide employees now. Almost all of our engineers are in Brooklyn, New York. We have some spread out throughout the US, but they're all domestic, I think. I don't think we have any international engineers right now. So our problem was we started to internationalize our site. And the first thing that you do when you internationalize a site is you tag everything, and you tag your site Chrome, and you hire translators who come in, and you figure out how to template it. And we did that, and we rolled out into Germany, and we noticed that we weren't displaying German-style place names because we hadn't really thought about it at the time. So we needed something that could allow us to identify a single place and display it in lots of different languages, the correct language for what our members were viewing the site in. The solution that we had with our current tool was every time we needed another language, we needed to make another API call, cache it really heavily, hopefully, so that we wouldn't hit our limit or pay for more. But we weren't really happy with that solution because it involves a round trip to somewhere off-site. That provider can go down, and then you can't see location names correctly. So we decided that we'd bring it in-house. And we display searches, or we display place names, and we do local search. We don't do any mapping. We don't have neighborhoods. We don't do any of that hyper-localization right now. And we don't have bounding boxes for cities, and we'll get to why. But search is a lot easier when you don't deal with bounding boxes. But we do use location for item search. And we're able to do searches of our items in Europe. We have about 1 million items for sale from sellers who live in Europe for some definition of Europe, and we'll get to that in a minute. 70,000 items just in Germany, 17,000 items just in Berlin. So we have this now ability to do local search and really sort of group it by city or by region or by country or continent. And we also now have the ability to display place names in multiple languages. And this came in sort of like as part of this whole project. So I set my user account to Munich, Germany. And I just changed the language that I was viewing the site in. And all of these just showed up on their own. Or, we built the infrastructure for it. So we have English, German, Spanish, Japanese, Russian, Greek, different character sets, different total display differences that sort of came along with doing all of this. So I'm going to back up a little bit to where we were before we did this project and what we had to do. So we were using Yahoo's API. Every time somebody did any sort of location search or set their location on the site, we did an API call out to Yahoo. We got back the result. We saved the result. We also saved what they typed, because sometimes they weren't exactly the same, and people wanted what they typed, not what Yahoo gave back to us as a display. And then when it came time to do a local search, you would go on the site and say, hey, I want to search in Berlin, Germany. We'd do another Yahoo API call. Generally, we would cache it. We'd catch it and not send it to Yahoo, but we would cache the result. And then we would use the text of the result that Yahoo gave back to us to do a text search in a location field and just return all the items that had a one-to-one match. So everything was in English. There wasn't, if somebody was in Germany and they typed München, Deutschland, we would save Munich, Germany in our database, and that's how we would bring it all together. We would put the latitude and longitude into our listings Solr object, but we didn't actually use it, and we didn't really have a good way to internationalize. We were caching this as best we could, and we broke memcache one day, and we lost the whole cache, and it took us like a week and a half before we built up a big enough cache to not be hitting the Yahoo API limit every day. So it wasn't, there were some issues. And we also ran into a problem that sometimes places changed their name, and we had no way to update the people who lived in those places to the new name. So the Yahoo API would start returning something differently, and all of those people would stop showing up in local search because we didn't know that the name changed, and we didn't have that feedback loop. So everybody would have to go through and save their shop's location over again if they wanted to show back up in local search. So this was a big problem, and I'm actually on the internationalization team at Etsy, not the search team. But because of this problem, and because of it feeling international, and because the search team's busy, I took on this project to do this. So what do we have to do? We had to bring 4 services in-house. One's a lookup service. People need to be able to choose where they live, and preferably they need to be able to choose where they live in their native language with localized place names. They also need to be able to, we're not super particular about what people want, but we want them to live in a city. We don't want people to live in Germany or to live in Europe. We want them to live in Berlin, Germany. So we need that lookup service to work for cities only. But then when people search, we want them to be able to search for Europe or Germany. So it needs to be flexible in that regard. We also need to be able to update this data, something we weren't able to do before. So we wrote a bunch of scripts using Ruby, Chef, and PHP to download the data from GeoNames. GeoNames does a dump once a month that's a little bit better than their nightly builds. So once a month we go and we get the newest data, and we process it all. We update our Solr search cores with it. And we also build a SQLite database. And we use that SQLite database for the display element. Every location on the site now is just represented by a single GeoName ID. And PHP can just say, hey, I need to know what I should display in German for this GeoName ID. And we return a string and display it. And it's super quick, and it's on every one of our web servers. There's no lookup. We don't need to cache it. It's really nice. And then finally, we had to modify our listing search to work with GeoNames. And the way that we did that was we leveraged GeoNames hierarchy. So if I choose Brooklyn, New York, where I'm from, there's an ID number. It's 5110302. And that's the city of Brooklyn, which isn't a real city. We'll get to that. That's also an interesting problem. But we also will then put into Solr the county, Kings County. We'll put the state, New York State, and we'll put the country, the United States. And each one of those numbers can then be filtered, and that's it. And that's all we need to do a local search, is run a filter query for one of those numbers. We don't put continents in, because continents are a little tricky. How many people here learned that there were 7 continents? Yeah, a couple of you. Some of you may have learned that there were 6 or 5. The borders aren't quite as clear as sort of Americans are taught to believe. So we don't quite deal with continents. We have sort of meta bigger regions that we let people search for, like the EU, which is different than Europe, or Southeast Asia, which is different than Asia. So we have this data source of GeoNames that really has been great. GeoNames has a lot of places, 8.5 million different places. We only need about 750,000 of them. The rest of them are things like rivers and streams and famous buildings. Someone asked me if the ISS had a GeoName ID. It doesn't. I looked it up because it is not a terrestrial object. But other big things sometimes get GeoName IDs. And yeah, and we really sort of get all of these great features by using this data set, and we can update it, and it's really helped us a lot in terms of getting to where we wanted to be. But we had to get there, and we had 800,000 sellers who had a city, a country ID, and some latitude and longitude, and that was really all the data that we had about where they lived. We didn't have their Yahoo Woe ID or anything like that. So we had to build a mapping that would go in and look at the GeoNames data and look at the data that we had for our sellers and say, hey, is Berlin, Germany at this latitude and longitude the Berlin, Germany that we're expecting it to be? And we ran that through for our 800,000 sellers, and we did all right. We got a couple wrong here and there. Like with Brooklyn, there are 3 Brooklyn, New Yorks in 3 different counties in the GeoNames database. Only one of them matters to me. But so we found along the way that there were some there were some things, but we tended to get it right because we would do it. Is it within 5 kilometers? Chances are you're getting the same city. If you're starting to be 25, 35 kilometers away, maybe you got to look at it a little better. We actually open sourced the code we used to do that mapping because a lot of people were asking about it. And then once we got all these new all our existing sellers to have IDs, we started just sort of ramping up slowly the way that people did searches, and we would do the searches simultaneously. We'd show one to the user, we'd save the other, and we'd compared for a while. And we weren't expecting the results to be identical, but they were always within a percentage. They were really close, and we knew we needed to transition, so we went with it. The hierarchical data that GeoNames provides, that ability to go from city to region, is really powerful because we don't do this yet, but someone might search in Missoula, Montana for a specific item. And if there's nothing there, there's nothing that's stopping us from saying, hey, let's search the whole county, or let's search the whole state, which for someone from Montana is going to still feel relatively local for them. The other really important thing, and this, like people, when they think of local search, they tend to think, find a point in the middle of the city and do a radius around it using latitude and longitude. And that sounds great at first, but it's not what we've found our members want in their search, because quickly you start to get things like, where is the middle of Brooklyn? Brooklyn's a pretty big place. And as you start to expand that radius, you start getting Manhattan, you start getting Queens, but you might not have every place in Brooklyn yet. And so how do you deal with that? Another sort of canonical example is if somebody lives out on Long Island, they care really, and they want to do local search for somewhere on Long Island. As you start to expand that radius, you get Connecticut before you get Manhattan. And those places in Connecticut are either a 6-hour drive or a $35 ferry ride from where they live on Long Island, whereas Manhattan's only 3 hours away. So it's closer to them. You could imagine some scenario where instead of doing radius, you're doing a path search based on driving distances, but that's really a very computational heavy search we're not ready to provide. So we really sort of leverage the counties and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about GeoNames' data set. These are all of the P class or P code things, cities, villages. We use all of these in our data set. Basically, if it has a P, we filter and allow it to show up. Except for the bottom one, which is PPLX, which is section of a populated place, which we found just sort of overlapped and got really confusing. It would be things like neighborhood names, and we weren't prepared for handling how that worked. There's also a whole A class, an administrative class, which in most cases is just a duplicate of the P class with more formal names. So like in all of New Jersey, every single town has town or borough of as an A class entry as well as a P class entry. So we really had to do quite a bit of experimentation where we just sort of built up the database over and over again and sent it out to our staff and said, hey, search for where you went to college, search for your hometown, make sure it only shows up once, look at it, tell us what it looks like. There's not really a great guide for how to pick these places. And things like in the US, PPL is generally a city and PPLA is generally like a town. But like Brooklyn is PPLA2 because Brooklyn's not a city or a town. It's a section of a larger city. And we had to sort of special case to figure out how to make that display correctly. In places like Germany, they actually use all 5 levels, and they're different based on the administrative structure of their towns and how they're incorporated and things like that. So you sort of need to experiment and play with every country that you're going to go out into. One thing that we also do, besides excluding PPLX, is in countries where we don't have a big presence, we exclude all places that don't have a positive population. So if the population in the GeoNames data set is 0, we don't include it. This really cuts down on a lot of small towns where we may not have any members. But we do get all the big cities. And when you're in Latvia or something like that, a place that you're not super upset that you have to choose a city nearby instead of your small town. But for our American sellers, they all want exactly the Canadians and the Australians, they want their small town to show up. So we expand and contract based, to try and keep our data set smaller. So with that, we have 750,000 different entries in our data set and 1.4 million alternate spellings. We'll get to that in just a second. So this is the 2 sort of tables that we use to keep track of all this data. And this is sort of the schema as that comes down from GeoNames. But it's really just the name, the latitude, and the longitude, and those classes, the class and code in the country. And then the hierarchy table is how you walk your way from city to country and all the parts in between. So Brooklyn, you can see 5110302, Brooklyn, latitude, longitude. It's class P, code PPLA2, US. Admin 2, which is states in the US, is NY. This 047 is Kings County. You have to look that up in another table, but that's the sort of data that we get. And the population you can't see there, but it's 2.3 million. Brooklyn's a big place. And because it's such a big place, we get it in lots of different languages, all as part of the alternate name table. So the main GeoName ID table has English spelling. It also has both ASCII and UTF-8 comma-separated lists of everything in this table so that you can search it. So if you're using SQL, you can do a free text search in any language of just that one table to get back a result. But if you want a specific language, you join to this table and get it. And you can see there's Farsi, Hindi, Korean, Chinese, Russian. Not every place has any translations. Many places are only in one language. They're only in the language of the country that they're in. But bigger cities tend to have lots of translations, and most countries have lots of translations. And this is sort of cut off at the top and the bottom. They also provide things in this like the Wikipedia entry for the town that you're in, which is called link. The ISO language is link. There's also the ISO language postcode, which had every zip code for all of Brooklyn. I had to exclude that when I queried to get this because it was just a long string of zip codes. So after we have all of this data, we build out a Solr core that we call GeoNames suggest. And it's just a autosuggest that we use Ajax to feed. It passes a filter query for whatever language the user is currently surfing in. people who come to our site for the first time who don't have a cookie, we use their GeoIP data, their browser accept languages data, and we try to establish a good guess of what language to show them, and then show an overlay saying like, hey, welcome to Etsy. We think that you're a German in Germany and want to view the site in euros. Is that true? And you say, and that would be in German. Is that true? Say yes or no. And if you say yes, when you come to enter a city, you're going to get the bottom result set instead of the top result set. And I like to use Munich as an example because Munich, Germany is a pretty different spelling than München, Deutschland. And that's you can see they both show up in German. And what we do to make these to make this a little easier is we use GeoIP, and we actually use latitude, longitude, distance to sort the results. So we sort based on how far from the member or the user we think that they are, and we also boost things with a higher population. So bigger cities, even though they might be slightly further away, get boosted up. If you just type Berlin and you're in New Hampshire, there's a Berlin, New Hampshire, there's a Berlin, Minnesota, but you might be a German who's in New Hampshire visiting, and you want to be able to get to Berlin, Germany pretty quickly. So it gets boosted up even though it's several thousand miles, several thousand kilometers away. And totally localized. So somebody may never have heard the English pronunciation of the town that they grew up in Russia, but if there is one, they'll type the Russian and the Americans will see the right thing. So the schema for that is sort of what you would expect. The language, the GeoName ID because we need it because we send it back to store it for the user. And then sort of regions and country codes. Regions would be states in the United States, but not every country do we display them. And we've done some back and forth about experimenting. We'll display country or regions in the US because you need states, and in the UK because basically every region has the same city names over and over again, stuff like that. So it's pretty easy, although we got this really sort of super nasty sort query to try and boost everything because Lucene isn't the best at allowing us to do the boosts that we want. But yeah, it works pretty well. And one of the things that's really helpful is the more specific you get, the fewer items there are in the result set, so the less the sort actually matters. So it's really helpful at first that if I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and I type BR, Brooklyn shows up because it's big and it's close. But if I need something that's further away, or I can just type more and then it shows up. So that actually solved a lot of problems for us because now we really only let people select locations that come back in that search. And if it's not there, you can type it and you can submit, but you won't show up in local search. And we don't really know where you live. We just know that you type things. So some of our users type things like the treehouse in our backyard, because they're trying to be. But we tell them, we pop up a big Ajax overlay. Hey, that's great that you do your work in your treehouse, but you're not going to show up in local search. Right? So. And I talked about this a little bit. Every listing gets the full hierarchy. And we do that as a collection of integers. So the listing search, we added this new field, and we put 4, 5, 6 GeoName IDs into it. And that's sort of how we choose or how we filter. And we just hand off a filter query, and that's it. I think we're looking to sort of expand that a little bit more when our results sets come back empty, automatically jump to the next level of the hierarchy, jump to the state level or jump to the region level and search again, and maybe even jump to the country level if you're still getting nothing wrong, because that's still an important thing. We found as we expanded, especially into Europe, that being able to search within the borders of the European Union was really important to our European members. Germany in particular, and the UK as well, if you get something shipped from the United States or from Australia, and they think that it's worth, in Germany the limit's €21. They hold it at customs. You have to take the bus to the outskirts outskirts of town where they open your package, they hold it up, they look at it, they decide that it's worth 22 euro and that you owe them €1.50 in tax on it. And you got to pay that before you can get your item. So allowing those members to search just within the European Union where they can avoid that hassle is really helpful. And so we link a lot of emails that we send include the local search sort of kind of quietly so that those members get a better experience. And yeah, and we still keep our old data fields in there. So if we ever wanted to sort of do more limitations on distance using latitude and longitude or just straight text matching, we can still fall back to that. And yeah, I think that's everything I've got. I'm happy to answer some questions or. Yes, OK, so the reason we chose SQLite was because we wanted a very quick key value lookup that was sort of, you pass it an ID and a language and that's it. And the whole SQLite database is just over 250 megs. So it's cheap. It can sit on every one of our web servers. There's no network lookup. So we were looking for a solution that we could do. And that's sort of the largest SQLite product that we use in our production environment, which is why we have to distribute it via Chef. And it's a little bit different than the way that Etsy deploys other code, but super fast to look up. And Solr, because we get to do these cool sort of things with geodistance, but some people I think might be able to solve both problems with just Solr. But for us, because of the way that we were doing it, we weren't able to. Thanks.